A father abandoned his disabled child right at a train station, leaving the boy with a small teddy bear and an empty promise. A few hours later, a man in a suit happened to stop by. And in the boy's eyes, he saw something he thought he had lost forever. What began as a single moment of pity slowly grew into the deepest bond, one powerful enough to change both of their lives. Because sometimes family can turn their backs on us. But true compassion comes from strangers. Before we begin the story, tell us in the comments, what time is it where you are, and where are you watching from? And if you enjoy emotional, human-centered stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another journey. And now, what exactly happened right after that moment when the man bent down to look at the boy? The answer lies in the next part. The November sunset poured through the enormous glass walls of 30th Street Station in Philadelphia, coating everything in a fiery orange-red glow. The kind of light that makes loneliness feel sharper, almost impossible to ignore whenever you look at it. At the far end of a long row of benches, a little blond boy, no more than 3 years old, sat curled up, clutching a small teddy bear with both arms as if it were the only thing he had left in the world. His name was Noah Jennings. Beneath his gray-blue socks, an orthopedic brace hugged his tiny leg, making each step, already difficult, even heavier. Noah had barely moved for hours. He simply watched the trains arrive and depart, his eyes following them quietly, and every so often he whispered, as though trying to convince himself, "Daddy will come back soon, right?" The little boy had no idea that his father had left forever. To understand why a father could abandon his own child, we need to rewind 6 months earlier. Harold Jennings, 34, had once been a skilled carpenter in the suburbs of Philadelphia. He had deft hands and a sincere heart. When he met Eliza, a nurse with a warm smile and a gentle voice, Harold knew instantly that she was the person he wanted to hold hands with for the rest of his life. They held a small wedding at a local church, with only family and a few close friends. 2 years later, Eliza became pregnant with Noah. It was the happiest period of their lives. Harold worked tirelessly, saving every paycheck to prepare for their first child. But everything collapsed in a single April night. Eliza's delivery encountered severe complications. She suffered massive hemorrhaging, while baby Noah was deprived of oxygen. The doctors at Jefferson Medical Center were forced to make a devastating decision: save the mother or the child. Harold remembered every second of that day with painful clarity. He stood outside the operating room, his hands shaking uncontrollably, the rapid beeping of machines inside pounding against his chest. Dr. Karen Whitmore stepped out, her face grave, her eyes filled with the helplessness that came with her profession. "Mr. Jennings, we cannot save both. You have to choose." Harold collapsed to his knees. How could any human being make such a choice? But when he looked into Dr. Whitmore's eyes, he understood that if he didn't decide immediately, both mother and child would die. Save the baby," he whispered, his voice breaking. Eliza passed away at 3:17 a.m. Noah survived, but the cost was unbearable. The lack of oxygen during birth had damaged his nervous system. Noah's left leg would never develop normally. He would need an orthopedic brace, continuous physical therapy, and might require surgery in the future. Harold held his newborn son in his arms, gazing at Noah's tiny face, and felt something inside his chest shatter into pieces. Not because he didn't love the child. He loved Noah with everything he had. But the crushing guilt, a weight he knew he would never escape. Every time Harold looked into Noah's blue eyes, he saw Eliza. And every time he saw the brace on his son's leg, he heard his own trembling voice echoing from that night. Save the baby. Life after that was anything but easy for Harold. His mother had come up to Philadelphia to help take care of Noah during the first 3 months. but she was already 68 and couldn't stay forever. When she returned home, Harold had to face the harsh truth. He was completely alone in raising a disabled child. Carpentry required him to work full days. Harold hired a babysitter named Martha, an older woman who lived nearby. With Harold's monthly income of about $1,400, he had to spend $600 on rent, $300 on Martha, and the rest on the never-ending medical bills. The hospital bills kept piling up. Emergency delivery, $42,000. Neonatal intensive care, $18,000. Physical therapy for Noah, $200 per session, twice a week. Harold worked overtime endlessly. He worked until 10, 11 at night, sawing wood, building cabinets, installing staircases. His hands grew calloused, his back ached constantly, but he didn't dare take a single day off, because if he stopped working, he wouldn't have the money to pay for anything. Then the construction company he worked for went bankrupt in October. They didn't pay the last month's salary. Harold suddenly found himself unemployed, with no unemployment benefits, and the debts still stacking up like a shadow pressing him down. He searched for work everywhere, but winter was approaching, construction slowed, and no one was hiring. Every door he knocked on came with a sympathetic shake of the head. That night, Harold sat in front of the pile of unpaid bills stacked high on the kitchen table. Electric bill, overdue. Rent, overdue. Hospital bills, sent to collections. Total debt, $63,000. Bank account balance, $127. Harold poured himself a glass of whiskey. Then another. From the bedroom came Noah's cries. At night, the little boy often hurt because the brace tightened around his leg. Harold got up, his steps unsteady, and walked into the room. Noah was lying in his crib, his face flushed from crying. Harold lifted him, holding him close to his chest, and felt his heart breaking into pieces. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm not good enough for you." Noah stopped crying, looked up at his father with big, round blue eyes identical to Eliza's. And in that moment, a wave of guilt surged through Harold, fierce enough to drown him. Eliza had died because of this child, and this child is suffering because of me. A terrible thought crept into Harold's mind, a thought he despised himself for even allowing to exist, a thought he tried to push away, but couldn't. If it weren't for Noah, I could start over. If it weren't for Noah, Eliza would still be alive. The next morning, Harold woke up with a hammering headache. The empty whiskey bottle lay on the floor. He turned to look at Noah's crib. The boy was still fast asleep, his little teddy bear tucked beside him. Harold knew he couldn't go on like this. He couldn't give Noah the life the boy deserved. He couldn't be a good father. And every day he looked at Noah, he saw Eliza, and everything he had lost. A reckless idea began to form, terrible, selfish, cruel. But in Harold's exhausted, desperate mind, it seemed like the only way out. If I leave Noah somewhere safe, somewhere a kind person will see him, he'll have a chance to live with a better family, with a better father. Harold knew that if he brought Noah to a social services center, they would ask questions he could never answer. They would try to help him, but they would never understand. No, Harold needed another way. A way for Noah to be found quickly, but for him to disappear. A train station, a crowded place, a place where someone would surely stop. That afternoon, November 17th, Harold drove his old silver sedan to 30th Street Station. In the back seat, Noah hugged his teddy bear, giggling every time a bus passed by. Harold parked, turned off the engine, and sat motionless. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. This would be the last time he sat next to his child, the last time Noah called him Daddy. "Noah," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Do you like trains?" Noah nodded, his little voice soft. "Yes, Daddy." Do you want to go see the big trains? We can walk around a bit." The boy's eyes sparkled. "Can Teddy come too, Daddy?" "Of course," Harold answered, his voice tightening. "Teddy can come." He carried Noah out of the car, feeling the tiny warmth against his chest. Each step toward the station felt like stepping on shards of glass. Inside Harold's head, a faint voice repeated, "Don't do this. Turn back. This is your son." But another voice rang louder. "The boy will have a better life. He deserves more than this." Harold brought Noah to a long bench near the main waiting area. It was bright, with cameras and constant foot traffic. Someone would see Noah. Someone would help him. "Sit here, son," Harold said, his voice shaking. "Daddy is going to buy us tickets." Noah obediently sat down, clutching his teddy bear. "Okay, Daddy." Harold knelt down so their eyes were level, staring into the clear blue eyes, Eliza's eyes, and felt his heart explode inside his chest. "I love you, Noah," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You have to remember that. Okay?" Noah smiled, completely unaware of the weight behind his father's words. "I love you too, Daddy." Harold pressed one final kiss to his son's forehead. Then he stood, turned away, and walked off. Each step felt swallowed by the cold concrete floor. He walked past the ticket counter without stopping, past the automatic doors without looking back. Because if he looked back, he wouldn't be able to leave. If he looked back, he would run to his son and never let go again. So he didn't look back. When Harold returned to the car, his hands shook so hard he couldn't fit the key into the ignition. He collapsed against the steering wheel and cried, the kind of cry only a completely broken man could cry. Then he started the car and drove away, leaving Noah sitting alone on a cold bench with a teddy bear and an empty promise. As the sun slowly dipped and darkness began to settle over 30th Street Station, another man was also finishing his work for the day. Brian Porter, 52, looked nothing like the image of a tycoon people often imagined. He wore a simple suit because after 30 years in finance, it had practically become part of him. But today, he wasn't driving his Mercedes back to the mansion in Chestnut Hill like he usually did. Tonight, Brian was driving a bus. It had already been his third week volunteering as a driver for the Philadelphia Public Transit Association. Not because he needed the money. His bank account overflowed to the point that 3 generations wouldn't be able to spend it all, but because he needed something, anything, to fill the enormous void that had punched a hole straight through his life. A void named Danny Porter. Danny, or Little Danny, as the family called him, passed away 2 years ago at 19. Not from an accident, not from a treatable illness, but from a rare form of leukemia, the kind of disease that even the best doctors and the most expensive treatments were powerless against. Brian remembered with agonizing clarity the day Danny was diagnosed. The boy was 16 at the time, preparing for college entrance exams, full of dreams of becoming an architect. Then the signs began to appear. Fatigue, frequent nosebleeds, bruises forming for no reason. Dr. Lucas Reinhardt, a leading hematologist at Jefferson Medical Center, had sat down across from Brian and his wife, Margaret, to say the words no parent wants to hear. He has acute myeloid leukemia, advanced stage. We will do everything we can, but the two of you need to prepare yourselves. Brian refused to accept it. He couldn't. He was Brian Porter, the man who built an entire real estate empire from nothing. The man who always found solutions to every problem. He hired the best doctors, took Danny to the Mayo Clinic, tried experimental therapies in Switzerland, spent over $800,000 on treatments insurance wouldn't cover. But money couldn't buy more time, Danny drew his last breath on a mild March morning, sunlight filtering gently through the hospital window. His final words to Brian were, "Dad, you did enough. You tried. I love you." Brian held his son in his arms as Danny's breath faded into the air, and in that moment, something inside him collapsed entirely. After the funeral, Brian couldn't return to work. He spent hours sitting in his home office, staring at the photographs of Danny hanging on the wall, feeling only one thing: meaninglessness. All the money he had earned, all the power he had held, none of it could save the one thing he truly loved. Margaret, his wife, found her own way to cope. She spent more time at church, searching for comfort in her faith. But Brian couldn't. He was angry at God, angry at fate, and most of all, angry at himself. Why had he spent so much time in the office? Why did he miss Danny's games just to attend pointless meetings? Why didn't he realize that time with his son was the most precious thing he had? A year after Danny's death, Brian left the company he founded. He couldn't keep living the way he had. He needed a different meaning, some way to redeem himself. So he began volunteering, supporting children's hospitals, funding leukemia research, and most recently, driving buses for the public transit system just so he could feel useful, still connected to the world. And that is why, on the evening of November 17th, Brian Porter was driving the final Route 17 bus past 30th Street Station. Brian pulled the bus into the loading zone outside the station. The last passenger stepped off. He glanced at his watch. 7:45 p.m. His shift was nearly done. But just as he was about to close the doors and drive back to the depot, something made him pause. Through the large station windows, he saw a small boy sitting alone on a bench. The child looked far too little, too fragile in that wide, cold space. And what made Brian's chest tighten was this: the boy was holding a teddy bear, the exact kind Danny used to have. Brian turned off the engine and stepped out of the bus. The November wind cut through his jacket, but he didn't feel it. The only thing he felt was a strange pull, as if some invisible force was leading him toward the inside of the station. As he walked in, the fluorescent lights cast down on the boy's face. Noah sat upright, his legs stretched out, one of them braced. He wasn't crying, wasn't screaming. He simply sat there, quiet, with the eerie patience of a child who had grown too used to waiting. Brian approached, his voice softening. "Hey there, buddy. Where are your parents?" Noah looked up, his clear blue eyes wide. "Daddy went to buy tickets." Brian looked around. The station was nearly empty. No luggage, no adults. Just a half-finished juice box at the boy's feet. "When did your daddy go buy the tickets?" Brian asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Noah looked up at the big wall clock, something he didn't yet know how to read. When the sun was big. That was hours ago. Brian's chest tightened. He knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. Those blue eyes, clear, trusting, looked at him as if waiting for reassurance. And in that moment, Brian saw Danny. Not because Noah looked like him, but because of that gaze, the gaze of a child who believes adults will never leave, who believes his father will come back, who believes the world is still safe. "What's your name?" Brian asked, his voice rough. "Noah Jennings." "And do you know your daddy's name?" "Harold Jennings," Noah answered, still hugging the bear. Brian stood, his hand trembling as he reached for his phone. He needed to call the police, but he couldn't stop looking at the boy. The quietness, the acceptance of being alone, the leg brace. Everything felt like destiny was placing a heavy responsibility on his shoulders. "Noah," Brian said gently, "I'm going to help you find another grown-up, okay? We'll wait for your daddy together." "Okay," Noah whispered. Brian led him to the ticket counter. Behind it was Jillian Page, around 40, packing up for the night. "Excuse me," Brian said. "I found this boy sitting alone. Did anyone buy a ticket under the name Harold Jennings today?" Jillian checked the system, then shook her head. "No one by that name bought tickets today." A chill ran along Brian's spine. He understood instantly what had happened. The boy had been abandoned. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. While waiting, he sat beside Noah. The child rested his chin on his teddy bear, staring out the glass doors, waiting for someone who was never coming back. "Noah?" Brian asked softly. "Before your daddy left, did he say anything?" Noah nodded. "Daddy said he loves me. Daddy told me to remember that." Brian felt his heart crack. He understood now. This wasn't a cruel man abandoning his child to escape responsibility. This was a desperate man who believed his son would be better off without him. Brian thought of Danny, thought of those final days when Danny said, "Dad, you did enough." Danny understood that some things are beyond anyone's control. But Harold Jennings didn't. He believed he was a burden, believed Noah would be happier without him. And maybe Noah truly would be. But not because Harold was a bad father, but because sometimes life forces us into sacrifices we never imagined we'd have to make. 20 minutes later, the police arrived. 2 officers, Cole Brennan and Mason Harlow, walked in with serious expressions. "You're the one who called?" Brennan asked. "Yes," Brian nodded. "I saw the boy sitting alone. He said his dad went to buy tickets, but that was hours ago." Harlow knelt beside Noah. "Do you know where your daddy went?" Noah shook his head, clutching his bear tighter. Brennan turned back to Brian. "We'll check the cameras and look around the area. Can you stay with him until social services arrives?" Brian didn't hesitate. "I'll stay." An hour later, the police returned with news. They had found Harold's silver sedan abandoned near the Schuylkill Bridge. There was no sign of Harold. No documents, no notes, no clues of any kind. Just an empty car, and a life someone had walked away from. Around 10 p.m., Rebecca Sloan, a social worker from the Delaware County Foster Center, arrived at the station. She was a woman in her 50s, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen far too many abandoned children in her lifetime. "Thank you for staying," she said to Brian, her voice low but gentle. "We'll take the boy to the temporary care center now." Brian looked down at Noah. The little boy had fallen asleep on the bench, his head resting on the teddy bear. Brian's suit jacket lay draped over him like a small blanket, shielding him slightly from the November cold. "Can I visit him?" Brian heard himself ask, though he wasn't sure whether the question came from his heart or from the hollow loneliness Noah had stirred within him. Rebecca Sloan looked at him, slightly surprised. "Of course. But usually—" "I know," Brian cut in. "Usually no one comes back. But I will come back." And he kept his promise. 2 days later, Brian drove to the Delaware County Foster Center, an old red brick building in the suburbs. Outside was a playground with a few rusted swings and a slide faded by time. It wasn't a bad place, but it certainly wasn't a home. Brian walked into the lobby, holding a box of puzzle toys. He didn't know what Noah liked, but Danny had loved puzzles when he was little. Maybe that was the one thing he hoped both boys could share. Rebecca Sloan greeted him at the door. "Mr. Porter, I didn't think you would actually come." "I made a promise," Brian replied, calm but firm. She led him down a hallway heavy with the smell of disinfectant and the dampness of reheated food. Through the small windows in the doors, Brian saw children, some playing, others curled up with pillows. Every face was an unfinished story. A loss the world would never know. Noah sat at a small table in the common room. In front of him was a blank sheet of paper and a dull pencil. The brace on his leg made soft creaking sounds every time he shifted. When Brian knelt beside him, Noah's face lit up as if he were seeing an old friend. "Bus man," Brian let out a small laugh. "You remember me?" "I remember." Noah pointed to the paper. "I'm drawing." Brian leaned in. At first glance, it was just circles and squiggles, the kind of thing a 3-year-old would draw. But after a few seconds, he noticed something strange. Those circles weren't random at all. They were perfectly proportioned. Noah drew a large circle, divided it into 3 equal parts, then wrote tiny numbers next to it. 0.333, 0.6666, 0.9999. What are you doing, Noah? Brian asked, fascinated. Noah pointed directly at the circle. Bear says if you cut the big thing into 3 pieces, you get numbers that run forever. You mean repeating decimals? Noah shrugged. Maybe. Derek Palmer, the caregiver standing nearby, walked over. He was a large man with a gentle voice. He's been doing it since he got here, he said. Doesn't talk much, but give him paper, and he'll draw numbers. All day. Brian stared at Noah for a long moment. A 3-year-old, barely speaking full sentences, intuitively expressing fractional division. This wasn't normal. Noah, Brian said softly, I brought you something. He handed the boy the puzzle box. Noah's eyes lit up instantly. He opened the box, laid the pieces on the table, and began assembling. Brian watched, and then froze. Noah wasn't trial and error like most kids. He picked up each piece, rotated it slightly as if seeing through it, then placed it in the correct spot on the first try. Within 5 minutes, he had finished a 24-piece puzzle, something most children his age needed 15 to 20 minutes to complete. Do you have a harder one? Noah asked, looking up. Brian swallowed. A faint but powerful realization washed over him. This child was extraordinary. That evening, after he returned home, Brian couldn't push Noah out of his mind. He sat in his study, opened his laptop, and began searching. Child prodigies, early math abilities, atypical brain development. The more he read, the more certain he became of what he had sensed from the very first moment. Noah wasn't just smart. He might be a prodigy, but there was something even more important. Every article, every study emphasized the same thing. Children like Noah needed a particular kind of environment, the right intellectual stimulation, proper medical care, and above all, a stable, safe, loving home. The Delaware County Foster Center could not provide that, not because they didn't care, but because the system was overloaded. Too many children, too few hands. A thought slowly crept into Brian's mind. A thought both insane and so right that it left him sitting in silence for several minutes. I can give him the life he needs. I have the resources. I have the time. And I have an empty home waiting to be filled. But first, he needed to find Harold Jennings. The next morning, Brian called Henry Dalrymple, the sharp private attorney who had handled countless contracts with him throughout his business career. Henry, Brian said over the phone, I need you to find someone. His name is Harold Jennings. He disappeared about 4 days ago, likely still somewhere around Philadelphia. Work-related? Henry asked. No, personal. Henry immediately understood that Brian's tone left no room for debate. It took a week. He hired a private investigator, combed through credit card records, visited dozens of motels and cheap hotels. In the end, they found him. Harold was hiding in a rundown motel in Kensington, the poorest, bleakest part of the city. On a cold, rainy November afternoon, Brian drove there. The motel was a crumbling 3-story building, paint peeling in patches, its cracked windows looking ready to collapse. The smell of mildew and trash seeped from the alley beside it, casting a gloom over the entire block. Room 2B. Brian knocked. No response. He knocked again, harder. Go away! A hoarse voice barked from inside. Mr. Jennings, Brian said through the door, I need to speak with you about Noah. Silence, then dragging footsteps. The door opened a crack. Harold Jennings appeared like a ghost of himself, aged 10 years in just a few days. His beard was unkempt, his eyes bloodshot, his breath tinged with alcohol. He wore a dirty t-shirt and ripped jeans. Who are you? Harold asked. Suspicion and bitterness knotted in his voice. Brian Porter, he replied. I'm the one who found Noah at the station. Harold's face tightened as if struck. I have nothing to say to you. He tried closing the door, but Brian held it. Mr. Jennings, I'm not here to judge, Brian said calmly. I'm here because I need to understand. Understand what? Harold snapped, though his voice trembled. You came here to tell me I'm a terrible father? That I abandoned my kid? No, Brian answered softly. I came because I understand your pain. Harold's eyes widened. You understand? Who are you to understand anything? Brian drew a deep breath. I lost my son 2 years ago. Danny, 19, leukemia. I spent over $800,000 trying to save him. And all of that didn't buy a single extra breath for my boy. Harold stood frozen, unable to breathe. Brian continued, his voice low. I know what it feels like to look into your child's eyes and realize you can't save him. I know the guilt, and I know the urge to run from that pain. Harold slowly backed into the room, leaving the door open. The room was dark, cramped, chaotic. A messy bed, empty bottles, clothes everywhere. He sank onto the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. You don't understand, he whispered. Noah. He lived because my wife died. The doctors made me choose, and I chose him. I let Eliza die. Brian stepped inside, closed the door, then pulled the only chair in the room to sit across from Harold. You didn't let Eliza die, Brian said gently. You made a choice no father or husband should ever have to make. But you saved Noah. Save him for what? Harold choked, tears spilling. To live with a father who has no job? Who can't pay medical bills? A father who, every time he looks at his son, sees the moment his wife died. So you think abandoning him was better? Yes, Harold sobbed, the cry cracking his voice. Someone better than me would find him. Someone who could give him the life I can't. I read about abandoned kids being adopted by good families. I thought that was the only chance Noah had. The room fell silent. Rain tapped against the window. Brian spoke slowly. Do you know what Noah has been doing at the foster center? Harold shook his head, unable to look up. He draws numbers, finds patterns, divides perfect circles. With accuracy no 3-year-old should have. The doctors say he might be a prodigy. Harold lifted his head, his whole body stiffening. That injured leg. You see it as a curse, Brian continued. But that brain of his? Extraordinary. Noah isn't a burden, Mr. Jennings. He's a gift. Harold broke down completely, crying hard, his whole body shaking. I abandoned him, he choked out. I'm a coward. I left my own child. Yes, you did, Brian said, not judgmental, but not avoiding the truth. And now you have to decide whether you want to make it right. Harold looked up, tears streaming. How? I'm not strong enough to be his father. No, Brian replied after a long pause. You're not. Not enough. Maybe never. Harold collapsed inward as if struck. Brian continued, his voice softened into a painful tenderness. But I am. I have resources. I have time. I have a home that's been empty since my son died. And I have a space, waiting to be filled. Harold stared at him. What? What do you want? I want to adopt Noah, Brian said clearly. I want you to sign over your parental rights. Let me give him the life he deserves. Harold's face went pale. You're serious? Completely. But why? Why would a stranger want to take in a disabled child who isn't his? Brian let out a sad, gentle smile. Because I once had a son I loved more than anything. And when he died, I thought I would never love again. But then I met Noah. And I saw a chance. A chance to do what I couldn't do for Danny. A chance to save a child. The room was utterly still. Only the sound of rain tapping at the window remained. Finally, Harold asked, his voice raw, If I sign, Noah will never know me? That depends on you, Brian said. I won't hide the truth from him. But whether you appear in his life or not, that's your choice." Harold closed his eyes, tears falling heavy. Will you tell him I love him? That I did this because I thought it was best for him? I promise." Harold trembled, then slowly nodded, as if releasing the last thing holding his heart hostage. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll sign." 1 month later, on a freezing December morning, Brian stood outside the Delaware County Family Court. His breath turned to pale white mist in the air, and beside him, Henry Dalrymple carried his expensive leather briefcase, wearing the calm expression of an attorney who had been through hundreds of hearings. Inside the courtroom, Harold Jennings was already seated. He wore a cheap suit borrowed from a charity, his hair trimmed, but his eyes sunken and exhausted. The eyes of a man who had lost almost everything. Noah was not present, Rebecca Sloan had explained. In cases of voluntary termination of parental rights, the child did not need to attend the hearing. And perhaps that was better for both Noah and Harold. Judge Eleanor Hastings, a woman around 60, with neatly kept silver hair and sharp eyes that had seen countless broken families, opened the session. "Today's case," she said, her voice steady and clear, "concerns Harold Jennings voluntarily relinquishing parental rights to his son, Noah Jennings, age 3, to allow Mr. Brian Porter to proceed with adoption." She turned to Harold. "Mr. Jennings, do you understand that this decision is permanent? That you will no longer have any legal rights to your son?" Harold nodded, his voice trembling. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you are making this decision entirely voluntarily? No coercion, no financial promises involved?" "No one forced me, Your Honor. I'm doing this because I believe it's what's best for Noah. I can't give him the life he deserves." Judge Hastings studied Harold for a long while, the look of someone who had met hundreds of fathers, yet still recognized this man's unique grief. "I have done this job for 25 years, she said softly. "I have seen fathers abandon their children out of selfishness, addiction, violence." She paused, her voice lowering. "But I have also seen fathers make painful decisions out of love. I hope you belong to the second group." I hope so too, Your Honor," Harold whispered. She turned to Brian. "Mr. Porter, you understand that adopting a disabled child requires a significant commitment? Medical care, physical therapy, and possibly future surgeries?" "I fully understand, Your Honor," Brian answered, his voice steady. "And I have the resources to meet all of Noah's needs." "You have been a parent before?" "Yes. My son, Daniel, passed away 2 years ago." The judge's expression softened. "I'm very sorry for your loss, but I must ask this. Are you attempting to replace the child you lost?" Brian fell silent for a long moment. A very long moment. He wanted to answer truthfully. Not legally correct, but morally correct. "No, Your Honor," he said at last. "No one can replace Danny. But Danny taught me how to love. When he died, that love didn't disappear. It stayed, with nowhere to go. Noah doesn't replace Danny. But he gives me a chance to love again." The judge nodded, her eyes gentle. She reviewed the file. Social reports, Noah's medical records, Brian's financial certifications. "The court has reviewed all documents," she said. "Mr. Porter meets all requirements, clean background, stable finances, and according to the report, Noah has already begun forming an attachment to him during visitations." She looked up at both Harold and Brian. "I approve the petition for termination of parental rights. Harold Jennings will no longer be the legal father of Noah Jennings." She changed her tone, firm yet compassionate. "And I authorize Mr. Brian Porter to begin the adoption process. There will be a 6-month probationary period. After that, the adoption will be finalized." The gavel struck. "This hearing is adjourned." Harold stood, his legs trembling violently. He turned to Brian, eyes bloodshot, voice rasping. "Mr. Porter, please, tell him I love him. Every day. Don't let him think I didn't." Brian stepped closer, placing a hand on Harold's shoulder. "I will. I promise." Then he added sincerely, "And Harold, the door is never closed. When you're ready, we'll find a way for you to see him." Harold nodded, unable to speak. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, his shoulders collapsing like a man who had just buried the last remaining piece of his soul. Brian watched him go, overcome with tangled emotion. He had just been granted the right to raise Noah, but he had also witnessed a father give up the only thing that still held meaning in his life. That afternoon, Brian returned to the Delaware County Foster Center to bring Noah home. This time, it wasn't for a short visit. This time, it was forever. Rebecca Sloan had already prepared a small suitcase, a few sets of clothes, the worn-out teddy bear, and the sheet of paper filled with numbers that Noah stubbornly refused to leave behind. When Brian walked into the common room, Noah was sitting on a faded old sofa, legs stretched straight out, the brace on his leg glinting under the fluorescent lights. He looked up and beamed. "Mr. Brian!" "Hello, Noah." Brian knelt to eye level, his voice soft, as if afraid to startle him. "Would you like to come home with me?" Noah tilted his head, his big round eyes blinking. "Home? Your home?" "That's right. And starting today, it will be your home too. You'll have your own room, a big bed, toys, and anything you like." Noah hugged his bear tighter. "Can Bear come too?" "Bear has to come," Brian replied, his voice warm like a promise. Noah slid off the sofa and took Brian's large hand with his tiny ones, the other arm wrapped tightly around the teddy bear. His steps were uneven from the brace, but he didn't complain once. On the way home, Brian drove through streets glittering with Christmas lights. Philadelphia that night glowed like a living holiday card. The first snowfall of the season drifted lightly, sparkling under the street lamps. Noah pressed his face against the window, mesmerized. "It's so pretty, Mr. Brian." "It is," Brian smiled, but his eyes kept flicking to the boy in the rearview mirror, and something warm stirred in him in a way he had forgotten. They reached the Chestnut Hill mansion when the sky was fully dark. Noah stood still before the 3-story stone house, its windows glowing warmly. He took a breath. "You live here?" "No," Brian corrected gently, firmly. "We live here. This is our home." Margaret Porter, Brian's wife, stood waiting at the doorway. She was a woman in her early 50s, elegant, with soft brown hair and warm eyes that always carried a trace of sorrow. Since Danny's passing, Margaret had withdrawn, seeking refuge in church and charity work, but her smile had become rarer than winter snowflakes. When Brian told her about Noah, Margaret had been silent for a long time. Then she asked only one question. "Are you sure, Brian? This isn't just to fill the space Danny left behind, is it?" "No," Brian had answered. "This is about giving a child a chance at a family, and giving us a chance to love again." Now, Margaret knelt before Noah, offering a gentle, careful smile. "Hello, Noah. I'm Margaret." Noah looked at her for a moment, then peeked out from behind Brian's leg, still clutching his bear like a shield. "Are you hungry?" Margaret asked softly. "I made chocolate chip cookies." Noah's eyes widened. "Cookies?" "Yes, and warm milk." Slowly, Noah stepped out from his hiding place and extended his small hand toward Margaret. She took it, as delicately as if holding a fragile flower. And in that tiny moment, Brian saw something he hadn't seen in 2 years since Danny died. A soft glimmer lighting up his wife's eyes, a spark of hope, a new beginning. For all 3 of them. The first night was far more difficult than Brian had expected. The room he had prepared for Noah was perfectly beautiful. Soft, pale blue walls, a single bed covered with a warm, plush blanket, and shelves filled with brand-new toys. But for a 3-year-old who had just lost every familiar anchor, that spacious room felt more like a strange, cold cave. Brian placed Noah on the bed and pulled the blanket up to his chest. "I'm right in the next room," he said gently. "If you need anything, just call me." Noah nodded, clutching his teddy bear to his chest like a life raft. Brian turned off the lights, leaving only the moon-shaped night lamp casting a soft golden glow on the wall. He closed the door quietly and stepped out. 10 minutes later, a choked sob made him jump. Brian rushed back into the room. Noah was sitting upright on the bed, his face streaked with tears, his tiny body trembling. "What's wrong, buddy?" Brian sat beside him. I'm scared." Noah burst into loud sobs. "The room is too big. I want my dad." Brian's heart tightened. Your dad can't be here, Noah. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." "Dad said he'd come back," Noah hiccuped. "He said he was just buying tickets." Brian pulled the boy into his arms. The lie Harold had been forced to use so he could walk away. Now it was a razor cut Noah still carried. How could he explain to a 3-year-old that his father wasn't coming back? That the man he trusted had collapsed under the weight of his own grief? "Noah," Brian said softly, rubbing his back. "Sometimes adults do things that make no sense. Your dad? He loves you very much. But he thought he couldn't take care of you the way you needed. So he asked me to help." Noah choked on his sobs. "Dad? Dad doesn't want me anymore?" "That's not true," Brian said, his throat tightening. "Your dad wants you to have the best life possible. And sometimes, loving someone means letting someone else take care of them." Noah didn't fully understand, but his crying began to soften, dwindling into exhausted, shaky breaths. "Mr. Brian, are you going to leave me too?" he asked, barely more than a whisper of air. "Never," Brian said, so firmly that even he was surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "I promise. I'll be here. Every day. No matter what." Noah looked up at him, his blue eyes wet and shining. "Really? Promise?" "Really. Promise." After a moment, Noah whispered again, "Mr. Brian, can you sleep here? On the floor is okay." Brian let out a small laugh. "I can do better than that." He grabbed his pillow and blanket from his own room and spread them right on the floor beside Noah's bed. Then he lay down, hands folded behind his head, staring at the ceiling as if guarding the whole world for the little boy beside him. "How's that?" Brian asked. "Feel better?" Noah crawled to the edge of the bed, peered down at him, and a tiny smile broke through the tear-stained cheeks. Yes. They lay there in silence, only the wind outside the window and the soft breathing of the two of them, one old, one small, blending together. Then Noah asked quietly, "Mr. Brian?" "Yes, Noah." "Thank you." A sting of tears burned Brian's eyes. He smiled into the darkness. "You're welcome, Noah. Good night." And that was their first night. Not perfect, not smooth, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, that's enough. The weeks that followed passed like a chain of small discoveries intertwined with big challenges. Brian quickly realized that caring for a 3-year-old was nothing like his faded memories of when Danny was little. He had forgotten the exhaustion of keeping up hour by hour, forgotten the endless ocean of patience a child needed, and forgotten the tiny, miraculous moments hidden within all that chaos. 3 times a week, Noah had to go to Jefferson Medical Center for physical therapy on his leg. Each session a full hour of stretching exercises, gait training, and moments so painful that the little boy sometimes broke down crying. The first time Brian saw Noah in that much pain, collapsing into the therapist's shoulder, his heart twisted sharply. He wanted nothing more than to scoop the boy up and take him straight home, far away from anything that could hurt him. But Fiona Blake, his physical therapist, placed a steady hand on Brian's shoulder and said calmly, "Mr. Porter, if we want Noah to have a chance to walk like other kids, we have to keep going. Pain now means freedom later." So Brian learned to stand beside Noah through every session, gripping his tiny hand, wiping his tears, whispering, "I know it hurts, but you're so brave. You can do this." And Noah really could. Each week he grew a little stronger. His steps became a little less uneven, and the smile after every session grew a little brighter. But the biggest challenge wasn't in his legs. It was in his heart. Some nights, Noah jolted awake, sobbing uncontrollably, calling, "Dad!" in utter panic. Brian would run into the room, gather him into his arms, but Noah still thrashed, "I want Dad! I want Dad!" Not Brian. Not the man holding him. Not the man doing everything possible to help him. He wanted Harold, the man who had set him down on a station bench and never returned. But to Noah, that was still Dad. And in those moments, Brian felt helpless in a way that hurt even more than hearing Noah cry from physical pain. He could give Noah everything: a warm home, good food, new toys, the best medical care. But he still couldn't give him the one thing the boy longed for: his biological father. Margaret sensed the struggle in him. One night, after Noah finally fell back asleep, she sat beside Brian in the dim living room, the nightlight casting soft shadows on the wall. "You can't replace Harold," she said quietly. "I know." Brian sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "But how do we help him understand?" "Not with words, with time. By being there, every day, and not leaving." Margaret placed her warm hand over his. "Danny didn't love you the moment he was born. That love grew day by day. With Noah, it'll be the same." Brian knew she was right, but on some long nights, when he sat in the hallway listening to Noah whimper in his sleep, patience felt like a mountain too steep to climb. But amid all the challenges, there were also small moments that felt almost magical. One morning, Brian walked into the kitchen and found Noah sitting at the dining table with a stack of wooden blocks. But he wasn't playing with them the way children usually did. Noah was arranging them into complex patterns: triangles nested within triangles, curved lines forming circles, symmetrical structures so precise they seemed impossible. "Noah," Brian asked, still unsure of what he was seeing, "what are you doing?" "I'm making patterns," Noah replied casually. "Look, if you take these 3 blocks and put them like this, it makes a bigger shape." Brian leaned in to look closely. What he'd assumed was unconscious play was almost a visual simulation of fractal geometry, a concept many adults struggle to imagine, much less a 3-year-old. A strong instinct nudged him. Brian called Dr. Karen Whitmore, the doctor who had delivered Noah, and she immediately referred him to Dr. Lucas Reinhardt, the leading pediatric neurologist in the region. During the evaluation, Dr. Reinhardt gave Noah logic puzzles, spatial problems, and a series of cognitive tests. Noah solved them at a speed that left the entire room silent. When the doctor presented a problem usually meant for 7- or 8-year-olds, Noah simply glanced at it, tilted his head, then gave the answer in under 30 seconds. "How do you know that?" the doctor asked, half testing, half in awe. Noah shrugged. "I just see it. Like seeing colors. Numbers have colors, and they match each other." Dr. Reinhardt looked at Brian, his eyes no longer carrying the usual composure of a physician. They held a mixture of admiration and rare astonishment. "Mr. Porter," he said, "the child appears to have synesthesia. His senses overlap. He sees numbers as colors or shapes. This is a trait often found in exceptional mathematical talents." He pulled up Noah's brain scan, projecting it on the screen. "Look here. The regions related to logical reasoning and pattern recognition are functioning at levels far beyond typical children. The oxygen deprivation at birth, instead of causing damage, may have activated some extremely rare neural pathways. Brian swallowed. You mean? I mean, Dr. Reinhardt said slowly, that Noah is very likely a mathematical prodigy, and with proper nurturing, he could become one of those exceptionally rare minds. Brian looked at Noah, the little boy sitting on the floor, happily assembling wooden blocks into intricate designs he invented himself. A child wearing a leg brace, a child the world might label as disabled, yet carrying a gift nothing short of extraordinary. What does he need, Doctor? Brian asked. Don't limit him, Reinhardt said firmly. Give him proper intellectual stimulation. Books, puzzles, space to explore. And above all, patience. Don't push, but don't restrain him either. Brian nodded. I'll make sure of that. From that day on, Brian began buying math books meant for children much older than Noah. But the boy wasn't intimidated by the dense symbols on the pages. Noah flipped through them, his tiny finger tracing the equations, then asking, "What does this mean?" And every evening, after dinner, the two of them sat together. Brian explained everything, bit by bit. Noah listened with a level of focus rare for a 3-year-old, and often asked questions that made Brian pause for several seconds before answering. One night, as they talked about numbers, Noah asked, "Uncle Brian, if 0 means nothing, why is it important?" Brian let out a soft laugh, the kind that carried both amazement and emotion. That's a question people spent centuries trying to answer, Noah. 0 seems like nothing, but it's what makes mathematics complete. And so they talked about the philosophy of numbers, about how emptiness could hold meaning, and why nothing was the foundation of so many things. A conversation Brian never imagined he would have in his lifetime, let alone with a child who had only just turned 3. December arrived in Philadelphia with thick layers of snow and the familiar air of Christmas. But this year, the home of Brian and Margaret Porter held more than twinkling lights and wreaths on the walls. This year, the laughter of a child echoed through hallways that had once been silent. Noah had never experienced a real Christmas. Harold had been too poor, too exhausted, too heartbroken to celebrate anything. So when Noah first saw the 12-foot Christmas tree standing in the middle of the living room, glittering with lights and carrying the crisp scent of pine, he froze, his mouth falling open in awe. "It's so pretty," Noah whispered, almost afraid to breathe. Margaret knelt gently beside him. "Do you want to help me decorate it?" Noah nodded immediately. That afternoon, the three of them decorated the tree together. Margaret lifted Noah so he could hang the small ornaments on the higher branches. Brian turned Christmas music on throughout the house. And in that moment, for the first time since Danny's passing, the Porter home felt like a true home again. On Christmas Eve, after dinner, the three of them sat around the glowing tree. Noah, dressed in new pajamas, held his old, worn teddy bear, the only friend that had followed him from his previous life. "Uncle Brian," Noah asked, his blue eyes shimmering, "why do people give presents on Christmas?" "To show that we love each other," Brian explained, "and to remind us of the greatest gift, love." Noah thought for a moment, then suddenly he slid off the sofa, holding the teddy bear tightly, and walked over to Brian. "I give this to you," he said quietly, but with certainty. Brian froze. That teddy bear. It was the only thing Noah still had from his father, the final piece of his old life. "Noah, I can't take that. It belongs to you." "No," Noah shook his head, his small voice firm. "You gave me a home. I want to give you something." A lump rose in Brian's throat. He glanced at Margaret. She had her hand over her mouth, eyes shining with tears. "All right," Brian whispered. "I'll keep it very safe, and whenever you want it back, I'll give it to you." The smile that spread across Noah's face this time was different. No lingering sadness like in the early days, only complete trust. "Thank you." Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Noah climbed onto Brian's lap, wrapped his tiny arms around him, and rested his head against Brian's chest. "Good night, Dad," he murmured, half asleep. Brian froze. Dad. It was the first time Noah had ever called him that. He looked down at the sleeping child in his arms, this abandoned, wounded little boy with a heart still big enough to love again, and felt something he thought had died with Danny ignite inside him. Hope. Love. A reason to live. Margaret stepped closer and gently placed her hand on her husband's shoulder. They sat together in the warm golden glow of the Christmas lights, and for the first time in 2 years, they felt like a real family. 5 months later, spring swept across Philadelphia in the soft pink of cherry blossoms. Brian stood in front of the same courtroom at the Delaware County Family Court, the place where 6 months earlier he had been so anxious he could barely breathe. But today, everything was different. Today, Noah stood beside him. The boy wore a tiny suit Margaret had picked out with meticulous care. The brace on his leg was still there, but his steps were far steadier than before. "Uncle Brian, why are we here?" Noah asked, his small hand tightly gripping Brian's. "To make something temporary become permanent," Brian smiled. "Today is going to be a very special day." They walked into the courtroom. Judge Eleanor Hastings sat on the bench just as before. But today, there was a gentle smile on her lips, soft as the May sunlight. "Good morning," she greeted warmly. "We are here today to finalize the adoption of Noah Jennings by Brian and Margaret Porter." She leaned forward. "Noah, come here for a moment." Noah glanced at Brian. Brian gave him an encouraging nod. The little boy stepped forward, the soft click-click of his leg brace tapping against the wooden floor. A familiar sound, but one that no longer carried the same sorrow. "Noah," Judge Hastings asked, her voice tender as if she were speaking to her own grandchild, "do you know why we're here today?" Noah nodded, surprisingly composed. "So, I can be the son of Dad Brian and Mom Margaret." "And is that what you want?" Noah turned to look at the couple standing side by side, their hands intertwined, their eyes filled with love. He turned back and answered, more clearly than in any of his language evaluations, "Yes, I want that." Judge Hastings paused for a heartbeat. Then she smiled, a rare, beautiful smile that warmed the entire room. "In my 25 years on this bench, this is one of the moments I cherish most." She picked up the file, her voice formal yet gentle. "Mr. and Mrs. Porter have completed the 6-month trial period with exceptional evaluations. Social workers, physicians, and therapy specialists all note consistent, attentive, loving care." She took a breath and continued, "By the authority vested in me by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I hereby declare, from this moment, Noah Jennings shall be known as Noah Porter, the legal son of Brian and Margaret Porter, with full rights and responsibilities." Her gavel struck. "Congratulations to your family." Brian nearly buckled. Margaret wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming freely. "And Noah!" Noah ran into Brian's arms with a burst of pure, ringing laughter that floated through the courtroom, a place that had seen far too many tears. "So now, we're a real family, right?" Noah asked, his bright blue eyes sparkling. Brian hugged the boy tightly. "We've always been a real family, Noah. Today, the whole world just knows it too." When they stepped out of the courthouse, spring sunlight washed over them like a blessing. Brian felt it. The emptiness in his chest was no longer crushing him. The space Danny left behind would always be a wound. Nothing could ever fill it. But love doesn't replace itself. It expands. It grows. Noah wasn't Danny. But he brought Brian back to himself, back to fatherhood, back to the capacity to love that Brian thought had died with his son. And that was the greatest miracle of all. The story of Brian, Margaret, and little Noah reminds us that love sometimes arrives late, but it is never too late. Some hearts that seem frozen by loss are warmed again by the most unexpected things. And some children once abandoned in the vastness of the world find their true home in the arms of strangers who once didn't even know their names. If today's story touched you in any way, if you believe in the miracle of healing, if you believe that family is not just blood, but the people who choose to stay, leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if you enjoy real, heartfelt, emotional stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next journey. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I'll see you in the next story, where love always finds a new chance.